Mara Vukovic was not the kind of woman people remembered when they first met her. She was quiet, she was lean, she wore plain clothes, and kept her dark hair pulled back in a simple braid. When she walked into a room full of fighters, most people looked past her without a second thought. That was fine with her. She had spent her whole life being looked past, and she had spent that same life making sure it would one day matter. The summit was held in the mountains of Serbia, far from the noise of the city. Every year, the best combat trainers, military instructors, and fighters from across Eastern Europe gathered there for 5 days. They tested their skills, they sparred, they competed in structured challenges. It was not a formal tournament, it was something harder, a place where reputations were built and broken without cameras or referees. Mara had not planned to come. She found out about her registration only 4 days before the event, when an envelope arrived at her apartment in Belgrade with travel details and a confirmation letter. At the bottom, in shaky handwriting, was a short note: "Go. Show them. Pyotr." She sat at her kitchen table for a long time with that letter in her hands. Pyotr Stanev was 71 years old and had been sick for the past 2 years. He had served as a special forces trainer for over 3 decades before retiring to a small gym in the hills outside the city. Mara had found him at age 19, the year a knee injury ended her gymnastics career, and the life she had planned completely fell apart. She had walked into his gym with nothing, no direction, no money, and no idea what she was looking for. Pyotr had looked at her for about 10 seconds and said, "You move well. Come back tomorrow." That was the beginning of 12 years of training. He taught her Sistema, the Russian martial discipline built on breathing, posture, and the redirection of force. He taught her Krav Maga. He studied biomechanics obsessively and taught her how the human body betrays itself, how every large movement has a blind side, how speed creates its own weaknesses, how a person who relies on strength alone has already told you exactly how to stop them. Mara was not a naturally aggressive person. That had worried her in the beginning. She had asked Pyotr once if that was a problem. He had thought about it for a moment and said, "Aggression is noise. You are learning to work in silence. That is harder, and it is better." She trained in near-total anonymity for over a decade. She coached gymnastics to young girls on weekday afternoons to pay her rent. On evenings and weekends she trained. She entered no competitions. She sought no recognition. She simply worked, and the work quietly made her into something remarkable, something that very few people ever got to see. When she arrived at the summit, the reaction was predictable. The registration hall was full of large men with thick necks, military postures, and the kind of easy confidence that comes from years of being the strongest person in every room. Mara checked in, received her schedule, and found a seat near the back wall. She drank her coffee and observed. That was when she first saw Commander Dragan Kovac. He was hard to miss. He stood at the center of the hall like he had been placed there by someone who wanted everyone to understand immediately who was in charge. He was 53 years old, former military, built like a man who had never once stopped training. His fighters gathered around him naturally, the way metal gathers near a magnet. His eyes moved across the room with professional efficiency. They stopped on Mara for exactly 1 second, then moved on. He said something to the man beside him. The man smiled and glanced at Mara. She did not react. She already knew what had been said. She had seen that exchange before in many different rooms, in many different versions of the same conversation. She finished her coffee and went to find her bunk. The next morning, on the second day of the summit, Dragan addressed the group after breakfast. He was a skilled speaker, direct, confident, and occasionally funny in the dry way that experienced military men often are. He announced that afternoon's main event, an open-floor challenge. Any participant could step forward and face 3 of his chosen fighters in succession, unarmed, no weapons of any kind. He explained the format carefully. The first round would be grappling. The second would be standing combat. The third would be a resistance test, a sustained physical confrontation designed to measure not just technique, but endurance and composure under real pressure. He looked around the room slowly. "Anyone," he said. "The floor is open to anyone who feels ready." The room was quiet for a moment. A few of the more competitive men exchanged looks, calculating, and then Mara raised her hand. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence. Several people visibly tried not to smile. Others did not try as hard. Dragan looked at her with an expression that was almost polite, the kind of expression a person wears when they are about to say something they know is unkind, but have decided to say anyway. "Miss," he said, "this format is not modified for any participant. The fighters you would face are not small men." "I understand," Mara said simply. He studied her for a moment, then he nodded. "All right?" She could hear the quiet laughter behind her as she walked to the floor. She did not turn around. The first fighter's name was Bogdan. He was 112 kilograms and had the kind of physical presence that made rooms feel slightly smaller. He had spent 15 years in grappling competitions and had the record to prove it. He did not look at Mara with cruelty. He looked at her with something almost like apology, as if the outcome were already settled, and he felt a little sorry about it. He came at her steadily, with the patience of a man who knew that patience was all he needed. What happened in the next 4 minutes confused him deeply. Every time he tried to establish a grip, the grip was not there anymore. Every time he advanced, she was not quite where she had been. She did not run from him. She simply existed at a slight angle to everything he did, close enough that he kept reaching, far enough that his reach kept finding air. When his balance shifted forward, she used that shift. When he overcorrected, she used that too. She moved with him rather than against him, and each time she did, a little more of his control dissolved. He found himself on the ground twice. The second time, he lay there for a moment staring at the ceiling, trying to understand the geometry of what had just happened to his body. He tapped the mat. He stood up and looked at her with genuine respect, the kind that is only available to people who are honest enough to be surprised. The laughter in the room had stopped completely. The second fighter was named Renato. He was a former national kickboxing champion, fast, technically excellent, and experienced enough to adjust in real time. Speed was his weapon. He had beaten larger and stronger men with it for years. Mara changed her approach. She became still. Not frozen, but profoundly calm. She gave him almost nothing to read. Her body offered no clear signals, no telegraphed intentions, no patterns he could identify and exploit. When he struck, she did not block the strike in the traditional sense. She relocated. She moved out of the space where the strike was going, and the strike landed on air. She did not try to match his speed, because matching someone else's greatest strength is never the right strategy. Instead, she made his speed meaningless by removing the target. She redirected twice. She absorbed one glancing impact without breaking her posture, and then, with the calm of someone performing a task they had rehearsed many thousands of times, she used his own forward momentum to guide him to the mat. 3 minutes and 20 seconds. Renato stood up, breathing hard, and nodded slowly. He did not seem angry. He seemed thoughtful. The room was completely silent now, and it was a different silence than before. It was the silence of people paying close attention. The third fighter was Marco. Marco was Dragan's personal student. He had trained under Dragan for 8 years, and in that time he had become tactical and disciplined in a way that pure athletes rarely are. He did not fight with emotion. He fought with structure. He watched and adjusted. He was trained specifically to handle unconventional opponents, and from the first moment he and Mara stood across from each other, it was clear that this was a different kind of problem. He did not commit to anything in the first 2 minutes. He probed, he tested, he offered false openings, and waited to see how she responded. Mara found no clean entry point. He was careful in a way the others had not been, and for the first time in the challenge, she could feel the real difficulty of the situation. The crowd could feel it too. The tension in the room was different now. Not the tense anticipation of watching someone about to fail, but the tense focus of watching something genuinely unpredictable unfold. Then Mara did something no one expected. She stopped moving entirely, looked at Marco directly, and in a calm, quiet voice, told him exactly what she was about to do. She named the technique. She described the movement. For a fraction of a second, Marco's mind went to the words instead of staying with the moment. It was not fear. It was not confusion. It was simply the natural human reflex of listening when someone speaks to you. A fraction of a second where thought moved ahead of instinct. That was the opening. Mara's hand found his forearm. A precise compression to a specific point sent an involuntary signal through his hand, opening his grip before his mind had decided to open it. His balance shifted forward by a degree. That degree was enough. It was over, in a movement that took less than 2 seconds. Marco stepped back. He looked at his own hand for a moment, still a little surprised by what it had done without his permission. Then he looked at Mara and nodded slowly, with the respect of someone who had just been taught something real. The room broke open. People were on their feet. The noise was sudden and complete, the kind of reaction that happens when a crowd has been holding its breath and finally releases it all at once. Fighters who had smiled to themselves that morning were now clapping with full sincerity. Dragon stood still. He watched the reaction around him for a moment. Then he walked across the floor, and the room quieted as he did. He stopped in front of Mara. He was a tall man, and she was not a tall woman, and the contrast between them was visible and exact. He extended his hand. When she shook it, he held the handshake for a moment and said, "I was wrong about what strength looks like." That was all. But from a man like Dragon, in a room like that, it was everything. The people around them understood what it cost him to say it, and that he had said it anyway. That was its own kind of courage. That evening, Mara sat on the steps outside the accommodation building and called Pyotr. He answered on the second ring. She could hear the effort it took him to speak, the way his breathing had changed over the past 2 years. She told him what had happened, calmly and in order, the way he had always taught her to recount things. When she finished, there was a long silence on the line. Then she heard him cry, quietly, the way old men who have spent their lives being strong allow themselves to cry, as if they are hoping no one notices, even when there is no one else in the room. She did not tell him it was okay. She did not rush the moment. She let him have it. "Good girl," he said finally, in a voice that carried 30 years of patience and belief in it. She looked out at the dark mountains and said nothing, because nothing needed to be added. In the weeks that followed, footage from that afternoon traveled quickly through training communities across Europe. Combat instructors shared it. Military programs reviewed it. 3 academies sent formal invitations for Mara to teach. She declined 2 of them, the larger, more prestigious ones. She accepted the third, a small program in a city 2 hours from Belgrade, and taught a single workshop before returning home. She went back to coaching gymnastics on weekday afternoons. She went back to her evening training sessions. She went back to the life she had always lived, which had never needed an audience to feel meaningful. A journalist contacted her a few months later, wanting to write a profile. He had seen the footage and was eager to frame the story as a triumph, a moment of female empowerment, a statement about the old world changing. Mara agreed to a short conversation. When he asked what it felt like to win in that room, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I did not win anything. I showed up as what I already was. The room changed. I did not." The journalist wrote the article anyway, and it was a good article. But the best line in it was hers. "There are people in this world who build themselves quietly, without applause, without recognition, without the comfort of being seen. They work because the work is honest, not because the work is visible. They carry what they know with patience, sometimes for years, sometimes for decades, waiting for no one and nothing in particular. And then one day, in a room full of people who have already decided what they are, the truth of what they have built simply becomes impossible to ignore." Mara Vukovic did not walk into that mountain summit to prove anything to Dragan Kovac. She walked in because an old man who believed in her had asked her to go, and because she loved him enough to go. What happened after that was not a performance. It was simply what she was, expressed at last in a room large enough to hold it. The Alpha King called her weak. He was not a foolish man. He was simply looking at the outside of something and mistaking it for the whole. He would not make that mistake again.